Hey, my name is Owen. I'm 33 years old and I've been living in a rented half of a duplex on Millbrook Street in Fletcher, North Carolina for about 14 months. I make furniture, custom cabinets, built-ins, tables, the occasional chair. I work out of a detached garage behind the house that I converted into a shop the first week I moved in, before I'd finished unpacking the kitchen. I work alone, which is the way I've always worked best. The shop is small, 22 feet by 18, but it holds what I need: a cabinet saw, a router table, a thickness planer, a workbench with good light, and whatever project I'm currently trying not to rush. I take 4 or 5 commissions a month. Custom work for people who want something built exactly right, built to last, built the way it should have been built the first time. The work requires, and this is the thing I can never explain quickly to someone who hasn't done it, complete attention. Wood has a memory. It records every decision you make. A joint that's off by a millimeter looks fine for a year, and then the door won't close. The evidence of rushing shows up exactly when you can no longer undo it. I wake up at 6:30, make coffee, check whatever I'm in the middle of, and I'm in the shop by 7. I work until 5 or 5:30, clean up, eat whatever I made in batches on Sunday, and spend my evenings doing light hand work at the kitchen table, fitting hardware, sharpening tools, sketching out plans, or watching something on my laptop with no real investment in it. By 10, I'm in bed. I know what each night is going to look like before it starts. I stop noticing that I minded, which I have since come to understand is a different thing from not minding. 14 months before any of this happened, I was in Raleigh, a shop there, a business partnership, a relationship, an apartment we shared in a neighborhood that had gotten expensive in the way neighborhoods do when everyone discovers them at once. All of it ended inside about 4 months. The partnership first. A disagreement about the direction of the business that turned out to be a disagreement about everything we'd been agreeing on for 3 years. Then Sarah, because she'd been watching me for a year, trying to figure out whether I was someone she wanted to build something with, and when the partnership fell apart, she had her answer. I don't blame her. She was right about what she saw. What I took from that year, what I brought south down I-26 with my tools and nothing else I couldn't afford to replace, was a specific lesson. I had been building my whole life around a structure I didn't own. I wasn't going to do that again. Build the shop, build the client list, build the routine, own every piece of it. I was done putting my weight on someone else's foundation. I want you to understand that clearly before I tell you about the note. Because the note didn't change who I was. It just made it impossible to keep pretending that being careful was the same thing as being wise. That Tuesday in October is where this starts. I came home from a job site in Arden around 4:30. Final fitting day on a kitchen renovation. Upper cabinets. Parked in the driveway. Got out, and there was a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper on the driver's side. I almost didn't read it. I assumed it was a menu or a complaint about my trailer blocking somebody's sightline again. I pulled it out and unfolded it. Handwritten, small, neat, legible in the way of someone who thinks about being legible. Call me. Nora. And then on the second line, in the same handwriting, with no ceremony attached to it, I've liked you since the day you moved in. I read it twice. I stood in the driveway holding it. The October light was doing what it does in the western part of this state, low and gold in particular, and I stood there with this piece of paper for a moment that was longer than I admitted to myself at the time. I knew who Nora was. The name on the other mailbox. The left half of the duplex. I had seen her maybe a dozen times in 14 months. At the mailbox, carrying groceries, leaving at 7:15 every morning, which I registered because I'm already in the shop by then, and I hear her door. She drove a blue Honda with a dent above the rear wheel well. She had small clay pots of herbs along her front step. She nodded to me the way you nod to a neighbor you haven't yet had reason to stop for, and I had nodded back, and that was the complete history between us. I folded the note, put it in my jacket pocket, went inside, made dinner, ate it. I did not call. 3 days. I want to be honest about what those 3 days actually were. They were not me thinking carefully. They were me doing what I had trained myself to do for 14 months, not reaching toward a thing that could fail. The note was, I don't have a word for it that doesn't make it sound larger than it was, but it was extraordinary in an entirely ordinary way. Someone who had been living 10 feet away from me for over a year had been noticing me, had been carrying something about me for a year and 2 months, and had finally decided to say so on a folded piece of paper rather than pretend she hadn't felt it. That is more nerve than I had shown about anything since I got here. I thought about it in the shop. I thought about it on Tuesday afternoon fitting a drawer slide, checking the clearance on both sides while my mind was somewhere else entirely. I thought about the word since the day I moved in. A full year and 2 months, beginning from a Saturday in August when I backed a trailer down this driveway and started unloading a router table and a shop vac, and not much else. On the third day, Thursday, I was at the bench working on a side table in white oak. Good material, difficult grain. One of those pieces that argues with you at every pass if you're not fully present. I was routing the edge profile on one of the legs. I went against the grain, went right against it, with the router spinning, because I was somewhere else in my head. The wood tore out. A chip the size of my thumbnail, right in the middle of where the profile would show. Clean tear out on white oak doesn't sand back. The leg was done. I stood there looking at it. I have been doing this for 7 years. I know better than to go against the grain. I knew it that afternoon. I had been distracted, and I had done something I knew not to do, and now I was holding a piece of ruined white oak that was going to cost me 2 hours and a night of glue-up time to replace. I put the leg down. I went inside. I picked the note up off the counter where it had been sitting for 3 days. I walked next door. She answered on the second knock. She was wearing a sweatshirt from Appalachian State, too large, sleeves pushed up past the elbow, with a streak of blue marker on her left forearm from whatever she'd been doing. Her hair was pulled back and a piece had come down on one side, and she hadn't fixed it. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was now standing at her door facing the fact of it, without any particular effort to manage how she looked while doing that. Which, I would come to understand, was exactly who she was. She looked at the note in my hand. "That's mine," she said. "I know," I said. "I've had it for 3 days." She waited, without reacting to that. "I don't know what to say," I said. "That's why I'm telling you about the 3 days." I didn't know what to say. She looked at me with a steadiness that wasn't quite patience, more like someone who has already done the hard part and is past being nervous about the outcome. "You don't have to say anything specific," she said. "I didn't write it because I wanted a speech. I wrote it because I was tired of not having said it." She paused. "Do you want to come in?" I looked at the note in my hand. "Okay," I said. Her kitchen was warm and smelled like whatever she'd had for dinner. She made coffee without asking whether I wanted any, which I noted as information. 2 mugs. The table had papers on one end. She'd been grading. Red pen beside a stack of what looked like lab reports. Student diagrams in 7th grade handwriting. She taught science. 7th grade. At Valley Springs Middle School. She said this while the coffee brewed with the directness of someone who has explained what they do 1,000 times, and has no interest in making it sound like more than it is. She liked 7th grade specifically because 7th graders were at the exact age when they either connected to science permanently or decided it was something that happened to other people, and she thought that window mattered more than most people understood. "How long have you been teaching?" I said. 6 years, she said. "I came to Fletcher from Charlotte 3 years ago." "What was in Charlotte?" I said. She handed me the coffee. "A relationship that lasted longer than it should have," she said, "and a job I liked well enough but could get somewhere else." Fletcher came up. It seemed like a good place to be quiet for a while. I looked at my coffee. "I moved here from Raleigh for similar reasons," I said. "I know," she said. "I mean, I didn't know about Raleigh specifically, but you seemed like someone who chose this place deliberately. Most people who end up in Fletcher didn't. What made you think I chose it?" She thought about that. "The first week you were here," she said, "you turned that garage into a shop before your furniture was inside. I watched you do it over 3 days." She paused. "Someone who does that knows what they came for. They're not here by accident." I thought about that. "You've been watching for 14 months, I said. "That's what the note said," she said. The coffee was good. Outside, somebody down the street was burning leaves. I nodded at the lab reports. "What are they building?" "A model of the carbon cycle," she said. "Most of them got the basic loop right. 2 of them worked out something about rate changes with temperature that I didn't specifically teach." She looked at the stack with something close to satisfaction. "I'm trying to figure out if it's their own thinking or something they looked up." "How do you tell?" I said. "By the specific mistakes," she said. "When you look something up, you get it right, but also wrong in ways that show you don't fully own it yet. When you figure something out yourself, the mistakes are specific to the way your mind works." She looked at me. "I imagine woodworking is the same." I thought about the torn white oak leg on my bench. "It is," I said. "After that first evening, the shape of things shifted in the gradual way of something that has been adjacent for a long time and has finally been acknowledged." She started coming to the shop doorway in the evenings. Not every night, just sometimes, standing there for a few minutes watching before going back in. I started leaving the garage door up later than I needed to. We developed the habit of coffee on weekend mornings. No schedule, no rotation. Just whoever was up first knocked on the other's door. On the first Saturday, it felt deliberate. By the third Saturday, it felt like how things were. She was not what I had expected from 14 months of driveway nods. She said what she actually thought, rather than what was expected. In the specific, unhurried way of someone who has learned the difference between being kind and being agreeable. She corrected things when they were wrong, not combatively, just cleanly, the way you close a cabinet that's been left open. The first time she came properly into the shop and looked at a piece I was working on, she asked about the grain direction in relation to the cut I was making, and her questions had the quality of someone assembling a working model of how something functioned, not of someone being polite. On a Saturday in November, she came in with 2 coffees and stood at the bench beside me while I worked a profile on a bookcase panel with a hand plane. Long strokes. Good posture. The grain reversed midway through the panel, which required easing the pressure at a specific point. "You slow down in the middle," she said. "The grain reverses," I said. "If I keep the same pressure, I'll tear it." "Is the fiber structure actually changing direction?" she said. "Or is it the angle of the cell walls relative to the surface?" I stopped planing. "I don't know," I said. "I know that it happens. I know how to read it. I've never thought about the mechanism underneath it. The cell walls change angle in interlocked grain, she said. It's not random. It alternates in predictable bands tied to the tree's annual growth cycle. Under magnification, it looks like a braid. A pause. I looked it up after you mentioned what you were working on. I stood there for a moment. You looked this up, I said. It took about 8 minutes, she said, with the particular modesty of someone who is always curious about everything and has learned not to make a production of it. I've been doing this for 7 years, I said. And you've never looked up what's actually happening in the wood? I know what's happening, I said. I can feel it. You know what? She said. Not why. I didn't answer that right away. Is there a difference? I said. Ask your work in 10 years, she said, and drank her coffee. I looked it up that night. She was right in every detail. Right in a way that gave me the satisfaction of understanding something I'd always done on instinct. And also, quietly, the feeling of someone handing you a light in a room you'd been proud of navigating in the dark. I didn't tell her this immediately, but I started asking her questions. She answered with the precision of someone who can explain anything to a 12-year-old without talking down to them, and applied the same skill to explaining it to me. The conversation started in the shop and followed us into evenings in one kitchen or the other, pulling on threads through dinner and whatever was left of the evening after. We had an argument on a Sunday in late November, which I'm telling you about because it was the first sign that we were past being careful with each other. I was working on a small cabinet for a client who kept changing the specs, and I had made a comment, not directed at her, just out loud in frustration, that the client didn't know what she wanted. Nora, sitting at my kitchen table reading, looked up and said she thought I was probably wrong about that. I said, "What do you mean?" She said clients who seem like they keep changing their mind are usually clients who know exactly what they want, but don't have the language for it yet. The thing you're reading as indecision is usually someone trying to describe a feeling to a person who works in measurements. She said she dealt with this exact dynamic with students who seemed like they didn't understand material, but were actually just working through it in a non-standard sequence. I said those were different situations. She said they weren't. Particularly, we went back and forth on it for about 10 minutes, neither of us raising our voices, both of us completely certain. Then I went back to the shop and called the client and asked her a different set of questions. What does the finished piece need to feel like in the room? And within 20 minutes we had the clearest brief she'd given me. I went back inside and didn't say anything. Nora didn't say anything either. She just looked up from her book and then looked back down, and there was a small, precise satisfaction in her expression that she was also not saying anything about. She was right. I knew it, and she knew I knew it, and we understood each other better after that than we had before. One Saturday she came into the shop while I was in the middle of fitting a set of drawer boxes and watched me work for a while. I gave her a piece of scrap maple and a marking gauge and showed her how to scribe a line. She did it once, looked at the result, and did it again 3 times until the line was consistent. Then she handed the gauge back and said, "Okay, I understand why you care about this. Does it translate to anything for you?" I said. "Consistency is the thing students can feel even when they can't articulate it," she said. When a teacher is inconsistent in how they explain things, students lose confidence in their own ability to understand. They think the problem is them. It's usually not. She ran her finger along the scribed line. This line is either where it's supposed to be or it isn't. Students need that clarity. I looked at her. She was looking at the scribed line with the particular focus she brought to anything she found genuinely interesting, which was, I had come to understand, a substantial amount of things. There was a Saturday in early December when she came to the shop with a broken chair. One of her kitchen chairs, A Windsor style, old, the kind that usually outlasts everything else in a house, had a leg that had finally worked itself loose from the seat. The dowel joint dried out after what looked like decades of use. She stood at the shop door holding it and asked if I could do anything with it. I could have fixed it in 15 minutes with a little glue and a clamp. I showed her how to do it herself instead. She sat on the stool by the workbench and watched me demonstrate the process on the loose joint, cleaning out the old glue, dry fitting the pieces to check the alignment, applying fresh glue, seating the joint, clamping it at the right angle. Then I disassembled it and let her do it. She was methodical and patient about it, the same way she was about everything. When she was applying the clamp, she asked what the clamping pressure should actually be. I said firm but not over-tightened. You're not trying to force the joint closed. You're holding it in position while the glue cures. She set the clamp and looked at me. How do you know when firm is firm enough? You feel it, I said. There's a point where the joint stops moving, and adding more pressure just distorts things. That's not very useful for a first attempt, she said. No, I said. It isn't. That's the part you can only learn by doing it wrong once. She looked at the clamped chair. Have you ever over-tightened? Many times, I said. In the beginning, mostly, she nodded, satisfied with that answer in the way of someone who finds it reassuring when expertise is described as something that was earned. We left the chair clamped on the bench and went inside and made lunch. And when she took it home the following morning, the joint held perfectly, and she knocked on my door specifically to tell me so, which she did not have to do, and which I thought about for the rest of the day. I started making her a shelf for her front hallway. Nothing announced, nothing asked for. I just had a piece of walnut left over from a larger project that was the right size and color, and I knew the small table by her door had too much on it and not enough surface, and I built a small floating shelf with 2 brass hooks underneath for her keys. I left it outside her door on a Thursday morning with a note that said only the dimensions and the species. She texted back, "This is exactly what that wall needed. How did you know?" I texted back, "I've been looking at the wall every time you open your door." She texted, "You've been paying attention." I texted, "That's what the note said." She came over that evening to thank me in person, and we ate dinner at my table, and she stayed until almost midnight, and she took her coffee mug back in the morning when she came over for the next one. Walter, who had lived in the house on the east end of Millbrook Street for 31 years, noticed things the way retired surveyors notice things, with quiet precision and no particular urgency about saying them out loud. He was 71, and he had the quality of a man who has spent a career measuring distances and still does it without thinking. He stopped me one evening when I was backing my trailer into the side yard, let me get it positioned, and then said, "The science teacher." I said, "What about her?" 31 years on this street, he said. 3 sets of people in that duplex. 2 of them lived side by side the whole time and barely knew each other's names. He handed me the trailer's safety cable. She borrowed a shovel from me the week she moved in to plant those herb things. Brought it back sharpened. That was the first day I knew she was going to stay. I said she seemed like the kind of person who stays. "I've been watching you leave the light on later in the shop," he said. 3, 4 weeks now. He looked at me the way he looked at things he had already measured and just wanted to confirm. A man works later when he has a reason to be somewhere. He turned toward his house. "Get the cable before it rains," he said, and walked away. The quietest part of this story was a Friday evening in late November. She had come over with wine, and we were at my kitchen table, her end, which she had claimed by the second week by moving my hardware catalogs 2 feet to the left and never asking. It had been a long week for both of us. She had a student she'd been monitoring for 2 months, the particular watchfulness teachers carry when they've noticed something nobody has named yet and don't know if they're right to be worried. She told me about it without asking for my input. She just needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear all of it. I listened without offering solutions. At some point I said, "He's lucky you're the one paying attention." She looked at the table for a moment. "That's the part I'm always scared of," she said. "What happens to the people I'm paying attention to when I stop being the one doing it?" "What do you mean?" She turned her wine glass once. In Charlotte, he never paid attention. Not to me specifically. I tracked everything about him. His moods, his work, what he needed in a given week. I kept thinking that kind of care, put in long enough, gets returned. She paused. It doesn't always. Sometimes the person on the other end just gets used to being attended to and mistakes it for how relationships are supposed to work. My right hand has a scar across the middle knuckle from a table saw incident 4 years ago. A raised ridge, slightly discoloring. Something I'm conscious of because of how it changes the feel of fine work. She reached across the table and put her finger on it, tracing the ridge of it once, and then let her hand rest beside mine on the table. She didn't say anything about it. In Raleigh, I said, I built everything around a structure I didn't own. Not because anyone asked me to. Because I thought what I was building on the inside was solid, that it would hold. I looked at the table. When it stopped being Sarah's plan, I found out it had never really been mine. I paused. I moved here so everything I built would be mine, so if something changed, I'd still have what I'd made. That makes sense, she said. The problem, I said, is that I've been so careful about not building on someone else's foundation that I stopped building anything that required another person. I looked at my mug. I had your note on my counter for 3 days. She looked at me. What finally made you come over? I told her about the white oak, the router, the grain direction, the piece of tear-out I couldn't fix. I've been doing this for 7 years, I said. I do not go against the grain. I know better. I was so far inside my own head that I did it anyway, and I ruined something I'd been working on for 3 days, and I stood at that bench looking at it and thought, this is exactly what I've been doing. With everything that matters, going against the grain because I wasn't paying attention to what was actually in front of me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you could have just come over, Owen, I know, I said. I put my name and everything, she said. I was very clear. You were extremely clear, I said. I had to talk myself into writing that note for 2 weeks, she said. I kept telling myself I was being presumptuous, that I didn't actually know anything about you. She paused. Then I thought, I've watched you show up in that shop at 7 a.m. every single day for 14 months. I've watched you think about your work at that kitchen table at night. I've watched you stop for the orange cat at the end of the block, the one that belongs to no one, and give it part of whatever you were eating. She looked at me. Every time. Without fail. I thought, I know enough about this person. The cat, I said. Every single time, she said. I looked at her. She looked at me with the full, direct attention she gave everything, her students' lab reports, the grain direction in a white oak panel, the wine glass she'd been turning in her hand all evening. Attention that doesn't need to perform itself. I'm going to stop being careful, I said, about this, about you. She picked up her wine. I'll believe it when I see it, she said. But I'm not worried. Marcus came on a Saturday afternoon in the first week of December. I was in the shop with the door up, working through a set of drawer boxes in hard maple, repetitive precision work, the kind of day I like best. A dark blue BMW pulled into the other side of the driveway. A man got out. Tall. A coat that fitted because it cost something to fit. The particular stride of someone who expects to be oriented toward when he walks into a room. I kept working. It wasn't my business. I could hear the conversation start through the garage door. Not the words, just the register. His voice, measured, building something. Hers, shorter and cooler. After 10 minutes, she hadn't closed the door. After 15, the tone shifted slightly, a tightness entering from his side. I put the drawer box down. I walked to the end of the driveway and stood there with my hands in my apron pockets. I didn't go to her door. I stood in the driveway, in my work apron, visible. That was the full extent of what I intended. He noticed me. "Who's that?" he said. "My neighbor," she said. "I'm just asking for one conversation," he said, shifting back to her. "I drove from Asheville. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I just want to be heard, Marcus," she said. He stopped. "I had this conversation in Charlotte," she said. "I had it twice on the phone after that. I'm not going to have it again in my doorway." She unfolded her arms. "I know what you drove, and I know what you think that means. It means you've decided you want something back, and you've come to get it. But I'm not something to come and get. I live here now. This is where I live." A pause, and then with complete clarity, "You should go." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has not often been told something this plainly, and had not built the vocabulary for it. Then he looked at me, the long, assessing look of a man trying to determine whether I was an obstacle or an irrelevance. "She knows where she lives," I said. "That's the answer." He stood at her step for a moment, longer. Then he walked back to the car, measured, unhurried, managing the optics of a retreat. He backed out of the driveway without looking, pulled onto Millbrook Street, and was gone. Nora stood in her doorway, looking at the street where he'd been. She was holding herself still in the way of someone who has done something that needed doing and is breathing through the aftermath. Not shaken, just finishing. "You handled that," I said. "I would have handled it either way," she said. "But having you standing there helped." She looked at the empty street. I kept waiting for him to stop. For almost a year after I left Charlotte, every time my phone rang, I had this moment of just checking whether I was glad it wasn't him. She paused. "It's been about 3 months since I stopped checking." I walked over to where she was standing. Wood shavings probably still on my apron. Maple resin on both hands. "I have a careful version of this that I've been working on for 3 weeks," I said. "I don't want to say the careful version." She waited. "I ruined a piece of white oak because I went against the grain," I said, "and since then I've been thinking about what else I've been doing that to. What else I've been working against because I was so focused on being careful that I stopped reading what was actually there." I looked at her. "You wrote me a note that said you'd been watching me for 14 months, and I sat on it for 3 days because I was afraid of what happens if I put my weight on something and it doesn't hold. And I am so tired of being that careful about things that are worth being less careful about." She looked at me. "Then, you held on to that note for 3 days. "I know," I said. "You could have just come over," she said. "I know that too," I said. "Owen," she said. "You know what? Not why." She stepped down off her front step and kissed me. And it was unhurried and certain in the way she did everything. And she smelled like her kitchen and November air. And when she pulled back, she was looking at me the way she looked at things she had already thought through completely and found correct. "I've been waiting 14 months, she said. "I can wait through the wood shavings." I laughed, the full kind, from somewhere real. The kind I hadn't managed in a good while. "I'll clean up," I said. "Finish the drawer boxes first," she said. "I want to watch." That was December. By the following May, the white oak side table was finished and delivered, and 3 people had asked the client where she'd gotten it, and 2 of them had reached out to me about commissions. I mention this only because it was the best piece I'd made since coming to Fletcher. And I know exactly why. You work better when you're not somewhere else in your head. Nora and I have been together for 5 months. We still have separate units, more by the slow inertia of a habit that has been quietly changing than by any actual preference. Her herb pots have migrated to my kitchen windowsill because the light is better on my side. My second coffee mug lives in her cabinet, because that's where it ends up when I stay long enough that bringing it back doesn't make sense. She is still a 7th grade science teacher, and still one of the best her school has had, which I know because a parent stopped me at the hardware store in April to say so without knowing I knew her. She still corrects things when they're wrong, asks questions with the full curiosity of someone who actually wants the answers, and stayed up until midnight 2 weeks ago, helping me work through the structural calculations for a client's built-in bookcase wall. Not because I asked, but because I mentioned the problem out loud and she'd already opened her laptop by the time I finished the sentence. She hasn't asked me to build her anything yet. I asked her once whether that was strange, living next to a furniture maker and never putting in a request. She said she knew exactly what she wanted, and she'd ask when she was ready, and she would be specific. I said I'd wait. She said I'd better not take 3 days about it this time. I told her I'd learned my lesson. She said, "You know what? Not why." She was smiling when she said it, the particular smile of someone who has found a line that belongs only to the 2 of them and intends to keep using it. Walter stopped me on the street in April and looked at me with the quiet satisfaction of a man who made an accurate measurement a long time ago and has been waiting to verify it. He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I spent 14 months in Fletcher building a life that was entirely mine. Every piece of it measured, fitted, structurally sound, and owing nothing to anyone else's plan. The shop was good. The work was good. The routine ran clean. I did exactly what I came here to do. What I hadn't figured out yet is that a thing built entirely alone and a thing built entirely right are not the same thing. I had been working with good material and solid technique and no particular vision for what I was making, which is how you end up with something that holds weight but doesn't have any particular reason to. Maybe the most honest thing I can tell you is this. I had a folded piece of paper in my jacket pocket for 3 days that said someone had been paying careful attention to me for over a year and had finally decided to say so, and I stood at my bench every one of those 3 days, working on a piece that would be beautiful if I just stayed present for it. And on the 3rd day, I went against the grain, not from ignorance, not by accident, but because I was so deep inside my own protection that I had stopped reading what was actually in front of me. I put the leg down. I picked up the note. I knocked on the door that had been next to mine the whole time. I know now what I didn't know then, that the most important joints are the ones built with attention rather than habit. That the evidence of going against the grain shows up long after you've called the piece done, and that some things you understand by feel, and some things you understand only when someone takes 8 minutes to explain why what you've been feeling is exactly right. She left her number on a Tuesday in October, in the clearest handwriting I have ever seen on a note left under a windshield wiper, with the simplest sentence she could have written, and from a torn piece of white oak and 3 days of stubborn, self-protective waiting, I finally walked next door and found out that everything I'd moved to Fletcher to build from scratch had been right beside me the entire time, patient and particular, and already exactly what it was supposed to be. I just had to stop going against the grain long enough to see it.